Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleagues Anushka, Saxena and Amit Kumar. And we are going to be discussing, we're three researchers working at Takshashila who are looking at China and you study Chinese foreign policy, Chinese economy, and essentially everything that's happening within the country. And we thought that we'd today catch up and talk about what's going on with Chinese foreign policy. Now, if you've seen social media over the past 5-6 days, you've probably seen that there's been a big balloon controversy between the US and China, and talks that were supposed to happen between the two countries with the visit of the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken have been postponed. But the fact that we got to the point where the two sides were talking and a serious dialogue was supposed to take place is a departure from where the situation was in August last year after the visit of then the leader of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan. Since then, we saw heightened tensions. But then again, from after the 20th Party Congress in October in China, we saw tensions shift away. There was an easing. Xi Jinping went to Bali. He met with Biden. He met with other leaders from the Quad countries, except for the Indian Prime Minister. He subsequently traveled to the Middle East and promised a new sort of proactive diplomacy. We've seen other changes in Chinese foreign policy with the wolf warrior in chief, Zhao Lijian, being moved away to the Boundary and Ocean Affairs Department of the Foreign Ministry from being the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry. And we've seen a new foreign minister being appointed in Qingang, who struck somewhat of a moderate tone. So there seems to be some sort of a change that's taking place in Chinese foreign policy. And that's sort of the thing that we're going to discuss today. And I want to throw that question open to Amit and Anushka as to what do they make of what's going on in what some people are saying is a charm offensive, apparently, from Beijing. So Amit, let's hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, so I'll just give a brief context about wolf warrior diplomacy. So during the second term of Xi Jinping, a phenomenon dubbed as wolf warrior diplomacy became quite prevalent among academicians and observers to describe the conduct of Chinese diplomacy with Chinese characteristics, if I may say, which adopted a very hostile and aggressive style of diplomacy while defending and safeguarding Chinese interests. And this approach ran quite counter to conventional notion of diplomacy. And as you correctly pointed out, Zhao Lijian, a former spokesperson of Chinese Foreign Ministry, even Yang Jiechi, the former director of Central Foreign Affairs Commission, these two faces emerged as the leading faces of China's wolf warrior diplomacy. And therefore, even though Xi Jinping, if you remember, had in one of the Politburo sessions in 2021 called for projecting a trustworthy, lovable, and respectable national image of China to the outside world that is not only open and confident, but also modest and humble. But not many changes were seen on the ground insofar as the conduct of Chinese diplomacy was concerned. And I think there were reasons why China persisted with this approach. First, I think China was facing a lot of international diplomatic pressure for its actions that sought to change Hong Kong's semi-autonomous status vis-a-vis China, which was guaranteed and governed by the basic law that protected Hong Kong's status for a period of 50 years, beginning in 1997 till 2047. But Xi Jinping seemed quite determined to integrate Hong Kong completely into China. And the actions were deemed a clear violation of an international treaty and the Hong Kong's constitution. So that justified, at least to China, an aggressive approach to defend its position. Secondly, with regard to the inefficient handling of COVID and COVID cases and disseminating of related information in time, and the questions relating with regard to the origins of the virus. And it clearly put China on back foot, and it was clearly cornered, and that also necessitated some sort of resistant and aggressive response. The Taiwan issue had been burning, as you rightly pointed out, before the Pelosi visit. It has been a constant irritant in China-US relations, and China regards interference over Taiwan as a clear violation of its core interest. And this is one issue that has clearly gained a renewed emphasis. Reunification with Taiwan has gained renewed emphasis under Xi. So this is something that they regard as a clear violation of their core national interest. And in addition to these factors, Xi Jinping was eyeing for an unprecedented third term at the 20th Party Congress that concluded November last year. And he did not want to appear weak on these issues, and Possibly these were the factors, I think, why China persisted with that sort of wolf warrior diplomacy. But perhaps now we can see that there are certain changes as it has started to reach out to the US and even Australia. If you see Australia, they have the trade tensions after Albanese became Australia's prime minister. There have been talks that the trade restrictions will be removed, and so yeah, after Xi Jinping has successfully secured his third term, he has shown some willingness to make tactical adjustments, and we saw this trend in the property sector, tech sector, platform economy, and he scrapped zero COVID policy also. So yeah, and these are the reasons. And if you also see, China's global image had taken a according to PwC's latest survey. And the reviews went down in countries like Europe, Southeast Asia, and regions such as Europe, Southeast Asia, and even South Korea, where usually perception of Chinese are not very unfavorable. So yeah, these are the things I think. Yeah.
So if I was to sort of summarize the argument, and you can tell me if I'm mischaracterizing it, predominantly you're saying that this wolf warriorism was a product of the environment that China found itself in, and domestic challenges, say with regard to the 20th Party Congress and the situation in Hong Kong, and the nature of the external contestation with the US. So it was essentially a choice of stylistic behavior predicated on these sort of base because of these particular challenges that it faced. And now that since the situation has changed, it is requiring a tactical adjustment. Right, if I've got it correctly, right?
Yeah, correctly. Right. So
okay.
The situation, yeah.
Anushka, do you agree with him?
Right. There's definitely some merit to what Amit has said, in the sense that there has been an increased moderation in the kind of foreign policy that is now being observed in the past 1.5 years. And it has in large part to do with the kind of backlash China has faced because of, say, its regulatory crackdown as part of its zero COVID strategy, or that there is a deepening sense of mistrust towards China because of any predatory policy that countries may see are disrupting their own economic growth. At the same time, of course, there have been domestic compulsions. There is a slump in demand and consumption. There is a kind of harsh economic environment that has slowed down the growth of important sectors in the Chinese economy, especially the real estate and property market. And so, yes, I would agree that these kind of domestic and external compulsions have led for China to adopt a more aggressive foreign policy approach in the past 4 to 5 years. At the same time, I think foreign policy was anyway becoming a more centralized issue under Xi Jinping. We see this with the changing of the Central Leading Group on Foreign Affairs to the Central Foreign Affairs Commission of the Central Committee in 2018. And this is significant because it shows greater control over diplomatic affairs and more bureaucratic power to execute interdepartment policy coordination. Now, they say that the LSG was seen as ineffective because it had a larger number of members and met only informally a few times a year. And the commission format has changed that as part of Xi's deepening of comprehensive reforms. So now if we look at China's new diplomatic team, which comprises of top diplomat Wang Yi and Foreign Minister Qin Gang, we can observe that Wang Yi has had an illustrious career, first as a vice foreign minister, then as Chinese ambassador to Japan and as director of the Taiwan Affairs Office, and then as foreign minister and now the director of the Central Foreign Affairs Commission. And Qin Gang has been relatively early in rising through the ranks, in that he was given a ministerial role right after holding the post of ambassador to the US and entering the Central Committee just last year at the 20th Party Congress. He has also, of course, been a foreign ministry spokesperson between 2005 and 2010. And so I particularly do see Qin Gang's promotion to the post of foreign minister as a relative easing down in the quote-unquote wolf warrior foreign policy narrative, because he is clearly well-versed in handling the media, and it's a skill I believe the Chinese desperately need to conduct foreign affairs henceforth. And so is handling of the US-China relations in a calm and rational manner. And if we look at the foreign policy priorities for China this year, I believe Wang Yi's article for Chuxi magazine from earlier this year sets the tone really well. So, for example, he says that on relations with the US, he says 3 things: that we will implement agreements reached by the top leaders of the US and China, We will seek to establish guiding principles of Sino-US relations, and we will correct the course in bilateral ties. So there is some forceful framing of the outlook on the US here. And on relations with Russia, he says that China will deepen strategic mutual trust and mutually beneficial collaboration with Russia. So even if the tone of the foreign policy has become moderate, the things that, like I said, have caused the mistrust in China are bound to continue. But on the other hand, where the charm offensive, as you put it, is being launched and should be launched on priority if China does have to leverage the bad image that Amit talked about, is in its relations with Europe. And on that also, Wang Yi says that China will achieve closer high-level communication with Europe, and I intend to talk more about that as progress. Finally, on the Taiwan front, I think Beijing has an increasingly nationalistic foreign policy that has resulted in a hardening position on Taiwan, and the US keeps stroking the Taiwan issue, which is sort of a red line for the China, one that shouldn't be crossed. So if one is to believe in Wang Yi's bid on course correction in the US-China bilateral relations, then I think this issue is going to keep flaring up in the year to come, even though there have been some signs of detente on both sides. For example, the issue was discussed on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali also, and then recently US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin also said that they do not see an invasion of Taiwan as imminent. So I think there is definitely a dialing down of heat on both sides, and it has to do in part with China kind of stepping back on its aggressive foreign policy narrative.
Right. So I suspect that you've probably gone a little bit further than Amit in sort of saying that, that this is not just, and again, correct me if I'm reading this wrong, that the shift in Chinese foreign policy that we are talking about is not just stylistic, but is also to a certain degree substantive, right? That there is a conscious effort to try and dial down temperatures with the United States. There is a desire to sort of hope potentially work something out with the Europeans, and that there is an indication that there is also substantive shift, not just stylistic shift. Would you agree with that characterization?
Most definitely. China has vested interests in preserving stable relations with the US and with Europe. And at the same time, it has to balance out its relations with Russia. So definitely there has to be substantive, meaningful shift in foreign policy. And it has to be shown, it has to be proven in action as much as in words. So you're right.
I think that's the next question that I have, is that have we seen any substantive shift? And Amit, let me come to you first with this. So, okay, we've seen some individuals being, like say we've seen Qin Gang being placed in the position of the foreign minister. We've seen Charlie Chen being taken out. We've seen, say, the pressure on Hong Kong is not what it was. There is domestic economic pressure and all of that. But have we seen a substantive shift? Because when we saw the new foreign minister travel to Africa, which is part of the history, a legacy of Chinese diplomacy, that at the beginning of the year the foreign minister makes a trip to Africa. Although he broke protocol this time because he stopped over in Bangladesh, that was technically his first stopover. But he reached Africa, and in Africa he talked about pushing back against Cold War mentality, camps. He criticized US policy, although his words were not as harsh, but he did criticize US policy. In the exact same, the meaning substantively was very similar. So has there been some sort of a substantive shift? And again, as we've seen in the last week or so, we've seen this controversy around this espionage balloon and things like that, which again, I don't want to blow that into something more than what it is, but have we seen substantive shift? We've also had a report from the Wall Street Journal, which talks about how China's trade with Russia, particularly when it comes to key technologies which can be useful for dual purpose and which can support the military campaign, has actually expanded in the last year, circumventing American sanctions. We've seen that a lot of Chinese, as per that report, trade data shows that Chinese state-owned enterprises have been engaged in this behavior. So that obviously reduces any potential deniability by the Chinese state. So have we seen any substantive shift? And finally, to make my point that in the Indo-Pacific region, we've seen a desire to engage with Australia. And like one of you rightly pointed out, that there is a dialogue between China and Australia going to take place on trade. But still, the restrictions that have been imposed have not gone. And we don't know whether those will be easy. At the same time, when it comes to India, we have not seen any effort from Beijing to moderate or ease ties, not even stylistically, forget substantively. So, in a nutshell, are we seeing a substantive shift, or is this simply, same old wine in a much more polite bottle? Amit?
Yeah. So to me, logic would suggest that given the environment that has one sees around China and especially the US led efforts at decoupling from China, especially in the field of critical tech, such as chip making, semiconductors, and AI. And this has led to some real concerns among Chinese policymakers. And something that she also pointed out in the just concluded second Politburo group study session, when he used the phrase strangulation by the foreign powers and quote technology. And if this materializes, this could immensely impact China's quest for innovation-led economic growth. I mean, what that it is seeking to leverage to offset the consequences of slowdown in the economic growth. And this will be further accentuated by the recent trends that we have seen in its demographic changes, declining population, aging of the Chinese society, increasing dependency ratio, etc. So there are some real concerns, and China does have a vested interest in making a paradigm shift in the way it conducts its diplomacy. Also, a very interesting thing that I've noticed among Chinese media sources is that there has been an immense talk about the need to attract overseas talent to fuel China's innovation and science and technology industry to compete with the US. And comparisons have been made with the US, how it has been or remained a center of attraction for new talents. And there's an urge in China to capture not only Chinese talent, but talent from across the world to fuel its science and tech and innovation industry. But a negative image doesn't help. So the logic would suggest that yes, China has a vested interest in making a paradigm shift. But you're correct. I mean, I'm not very sure to what extent this outreach, if it is existing, would go, because it would also depend on how, because the US looks quite determined to eliminate and decouple and to restrict China from accessing certain critical technology and access to certain key sectors. So if US, and there's a bipartisan support within the US, and if that US remains determined, it'll be I think we'll have to wait and see how far does China actually go, and I mean it stays on this path of course correction. With regards to India, yes, I think with Australia and with US, we have seen certain overtures being made. There was a visit was planned by Blinken, which got cancelled unfortunately because of this the Chinese spy balloon. But and there have been also talks of trade talks and trade easing of restrictions regard to Australia. But insofar as India is concerned, I think we haven't quite correctly pointed out we have not seen any signs of easing on this front. And I think it could be out of maybe this is thinking among the Chinese that India has very little to offer at this stage, and maybe something that it does not have to bargain with. And yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're basically saying that yes, there is some degree of substantive shift that is taking place, but much more needs to happen. And at the same time, this shift is being done from a pragmatic sort of calculation point of view of what is there to gain by adjusting with certain entities versus the others. Anushka, your thoughts on this? I mean, again, do you actually see substantive shift taking place? Or is it a case that it is desirable that there will be substantive shifts, but then it's not something that we're seeing at present? Your thoughts on that?
So I would say that not only is it desirable that there be a substantive shift, I believe there are already attempts in that direction. But yes, substantive shifts are yet to be seen in full play at the moment. So I'd first like to talk about the spy balloon incident. I think the points that Wang Yi made about how China is going to tackle its US policy this year, where he talked about course correction in bilateral relations and establishing guiding principle in Sino-US relations, should also be read with another point that he made about an overall foreign policy approach, but in a manner clearly targeted at the US. He pledged to fight back in the new year against all forms of hegemony, rebuff any attempts by external forces to interfere with China's domestic affairs, as well as defend China's sovereignty and security. I think these were some of the points Amit was referring to. And I think these 2 points that have to be read together read really well in the context of what happened with the Blinken visit. The Blinken visit episode has significantly derailed hopes for an immediate detente, even though there were substantive attempts on Qingdang's and China's side to make US-China peace and stability talks happen. And this is not to say that the visit was going to generate any major positive outcomes for the US-China relations right away, but it would have been a good start in the efforts to dial down the heat. But then domestically in China, commentators have been really sullen about Blinken's visit publicly. And some commentaries by IR professors and others show a distaste for Blinken's policy personally because of his comments at Anchorage and then the speeches he gave, where he more often than he should said condemned China as quote unquote the most serious long-term challenge to the international order. So in a way, Spygate doesn't just seem to be a stroke of luck. But again, in a way, his comments are understandable given the charged nature of debate on China within America and the intended public audience. Regardless, it doesn't send a good message to Beijing.
I think they will be much more happier with Blinken than with Mike Pompeo, who was once enemy number one. So, as much as I see Chinese IR professors frothing about statements by Anthony Blinken, I think that they too recognize that somebody who's in the current administration, there's a clear difference between how the current administration is approaching them as opposed to say how the previous one was. Sorry for that interruption. Please go ahead.
No, absolutely. I most definitely agree with that, which is why I believe that when we discuss whether there has been a substantive shift in the foreign policy narrative within China, we also have to see what the kind of response to that is. And I think Blinken's comments are pretty much in tandem with what trends in US foreign policy and narrative have been. And so I don't think that's kind of a novel development or a bigger threat to China than it already was, say, in the previous administration. But if we look at where the most substantive change has happened or where it would ideally be happening this year is Europe. So the point about Europe is critical to address in the question of whether Chinese foreign policy will become more accommodating or not in 2023 is because more than the US, China has to prevent its decoupling with the EU. And this is because EU is one of China's largest trading partners. And if one is to accept the proposition that domestic factors do indeed shape foreign policy, China needs the EU as a ranking customer to meet the domestic economic demands and expand consumption and growth in critical sectors. Secondly, good relations with the EU balance the China-US rivalry scale. This is why China's charm offensive is launched at full scale on the EU front. First, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited China in November last year, then European Council President Charles Michel in December, and then Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni accepted Xi's invitation to visit Beijing at the G20 summit in December. And now Macron is signaling intent to visit the country as soon as possible. And both Macron and Scholz have opposed decoupling from China, even though they have mentioned reducing dependency. But again, grave challenges exist in China's EU policy because the most pertinent is the erosion of trust in the latter due to China's inability to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine outright. And there is absolutely no softening of the stance of China on the Russia-Ukraine war issue, and instead more strategic signaling is underway on expanding China-Russia bilateral relations. As you rightly pointed out, reports are suggesting that a great amount of Chinese export, especially in dual-use components for military equipment, is being directed towards Russia, even as the sanctions regime is underway. So as far as the question of accommodation goes, there is a great game of balance at play, which is on the one hand, she is busy wooing its largest trading partner, and on the other hand, its ties with Russia are advancing on solid footing. And this would hence be the most interesting development to watch out for this year, I believe, especially since China has to achieve its quote-unquote purpose of resetting its economy and winning back friends. And just quickly on the issue of strategic tensions with, say, Japan, Korea, and India, there is little sign of moderation. Like we discussed, border incidents with India have continued, and so too has the military pressure against Japan in the East China Sea. Japan also continues to significantly increase its military budget, and they want to double it by 2027 and intensify its security relationship with the US and Australia. And a narrative shift is also taking place in Tokyo, where its documents and communiques now explicitly name China as the central rationale behind Japan's rapidly changing military posture, which was more subtle, which was by implication in the past, but not so much anymore. And China has also initiated retaliatory measures against both Japan and Korea because they imposed mandatory COVID testing requirements for Chinese citizens. So the one exception indeed that stands out in the Indo-Pacific or among the Quad countries is China's posture towards Australia, where previous punitive economic measures have begun to be removed and ministerial level political contact has resumed. I think just this afternoon, Senator Farrell and a Chinese diplomat have conversed on video call. And I think the Chinese diplomat has extended an invitation to Senator Farrell to visit Beijing, which has been accepted. So, apart from Australia, China's military and foreign policy towards close strategic partners of the US in the Asia Pacific appears to have changed very little, which is why I argued that it is not only important to see whether there is a substantive shift on the Chinese policy front, but also if it's being received and how it is being received in these countries.
Okay, that's great. That's a really good sweep of what's taking place. And I agree with you. I think that there is one needs to sort of watch if the substantive shift takes place, because so far, say, with regard to Australia, the punitive trade measures have not been removed. Although, like you said, dialogue has resumed, which is important given that it's been nearly 3 years, 4 years since this dialogue sort of took place. So, to my sort of, I have two questions and brief replies from both of you. The final two questions. Firstly, for India, Anushka, since Amit has probably already speculated on this, so I'll just come to you with this, which is that we spoke about China trying to sort of improve its relationship and try to sort of at least soften the friction between in its relationship with European countries, with the United States, because even with this balloon incident, I mean, Wang Yi's statement was essentially about not wanting to derail the talks, although that was also accompanied by a really daft foreign ministry statement, which said something to the effect of, we've never officially announced these talks, so, the US can do what it wants to do, which was clearly absurd. But at the end of the day, with India, we've not seen any sort of thaw or even an indication that there will be a thaw. And going into an election, India is going into an election year next year. And this is G20 year for India. India is the president of G20. So do we anticipate that this warmth that Xi Jinping seems to be radiating nowadays will also impact the ice in Ladakh?
So I think there appears to be very little to no sign of relief on the Ladakh front or in the India-China relations. We see the Tawang clash happen, and we see that a slew of border talks have yielded little to no results, and it has taken a long time for disengagement to happen on some of the most crucial areas of conflict, the 5 patrolling points that have been making a lot of rounds in the news and in analytical discussions. And I think this could also have in part to do with the fact that India's relations with Washington are warming. Not entirely though, because India still draws Washington's ire because it fails to take a quote-unquote hardline stance against Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. Regardless, India and America have announced the creation of an initiative on critical and emerging technologies. And in a way, America's quest to be world leader in artificial intelligence is seeing India's support. India and America are cooperating on the Quad front. And so these are kind of developments that are drawing China's ire. And so on the Ladakh front, on the border front, there seem to be no signs of reprieve. And I'm expecting it to continue this way. I'm expecting that there will be some low-key but continued transgressions that will continue to happen along the border until and unless there can be some significant or radical kind of foreign policy debate that takes place between the two countries. And this is regardless of the fact that economic cooperation between the two countries and India's kind of debt or the export-import imbalance between China and India, with China having the upper hand, has not gone anywhere. India still has a massive kind of debt against China, and virtually there's no economic decoupling happening at all. But despite this, we see that border tensions continue, and so does the warming up of India-US relations. And I think this is likely to keep inviting some form or the other form of aggression from China in the coming few months.
Yes, the trade deficit is one thing, but it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, while Beijing is seemingly reaching out to many other countries, including other Quad partners, there was a dialogue between Qin Gang and the Japanese foreign minister also recently. There has been no outreach to India whatsoever. And the new foreign minister has not felt the need to dial his Indian counterpart at all. So it's something that's worth noting, and I think it's something that's worth trying to figure out as to why is it that Beijing doesn't feel the need to try and reorient its relationship with India if it is actually interested in substantive shifts in its policy. With that, my final question, I think, to both of you, and I would appreciate a one sentence answer or a one word answer, is we've seen years of wolf warriorism, we've seen years of very aggressive diplomacy, we've seen years of assertion on territorial issues, on changing the status quo, whether it was in the South China Sea or on the boundary with Bhutan or with India. We've seen a much more proactive, aggressive foreign policy on issues like development, security, human rights, all of that, which has led to those perceptions falling, which Amit pointed to at the beginning of this conversation in the Pew survey, and of course in other parts of the world also, which the Pew survey may have not covered, says India. Can this stylistic shift now put the genie back in the bottle? Can you build trust after having gone through not just these years of aggression externally, but also years of internal repression where the system, which seemed to be moving towards some degree of transparency, has closed in on itself? So can you put the genie back in the bottle if you're Xi Jinping? That's my question to both of you. And I would appreciate a brief answer and we can wrap up.
Yeah. So I think it would be quite difficult given, like you said, the perception has worsened with regard to China. So it would be very difficult, especially if it's a tech war between the US and China intensifies and countries are forced to choose sides. It will be very difficult, say, going forward. But yeah, it needs to be seen.
Okay. Anushka?
I would say this is definitely a quote unquote needs to be seen situation. But yes, if one refers to Liu He's speech at the Davos Forum, I think the way forward for China to go is to continuously harp on the narrative of international cooperation, especially on key issues such as debt, inflation, supply chain resilience, and climate change mitigation, as well as the international division of labor, which did emerge as key themes in his speech. And I would say that despite the substantive attempts at shifting the tone of foreign policy, China would have to assess whether these are being well received or not at the other end, and who are the parties that are yet to receive this substantive shift in foreign policy engagement, as we saw in the case, as we discussed in the case of India. And so until and unless these considerations are made and there is real substantive action on the ground, I do not feel that the genie can indeed be put back in the bottle, at least in the short to medium terms. That's all.
All right. So with that, we'll call it an end to this conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your thoughts. I think this was a really fascinating discussion. And I agree with the fact that I don't think the genie is going to go back in the bottle so easily. You can't be talking about international cooperation and openness while you're in Davos, but going home and talking about self-reliance and dual circulation and seizing the commanding heights of competition at home while focusing on domestic circulation. So you can't be doing both of those things. But then it's something that we'll have to wait and see. Like you said, my sense is also that you can't end up sort of putting the genie back in the bottle. Intentions once revealed in this manner are unlikely to be forgotten unless, like you said, there is a significant and substantive change in Chinese behavior on key issues, which I believe are also their core interests. With that, thank you so much, both of you, and thank you so much, folks, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.